各位，在2018年，美国政府对中兴与华为下达了禁令，切断了来自美国的关键技术供应。那一刻，许多人认为中国的高科技梦会因此而坍塌。但7年过去了，局势似乎出现了反转。如今，被法国圈内称为中国问题专家的经济学者路易斯站在镜头前，语气坚定地说出一句令西方震惊的话：中国不仅在制造业复苏了，更在几乎所有科技领域完成了对西方的超越。他并非来自中国，也不是中国的代言人，而是一位亲眼目睹变化的欧洲学者。从2018年到2005年，他追踪了中美科技竞争的全过程。他回忆到，当年的华为被制裁，芯片供应被切断，中国的反应不是抱怨，而是启动了一场史无前例的国家级研发动员。房地产的资金被抽走流入半导体，游戏公司被要求转向服务器和芯片研发，全国顶尖的工程师从清华到复旦都被召回了实验室，重新定义国家的科技方向。这一刻是被定义为中国的斯普特尼克时刻，一种被迫后的觉醒。在那时起，中国的人力资本被重新分配，每年1200万大学毕业生中大量投入工科领域。短短数年，中国已经在新能源汽车、通讯设备和电影工业制造上取得了突破。连他这样出生在法国的观察者都承认，今天在中国，一辆欧洲车已经不如一辆中国车。他举一个例子，奥迪为了挽回形象，不得不在中国市场改名本土化，而福特的 CEO 在参观中国后，竟买下一辆中国品牌的电动车带回美国。那一刻，路易斯意识到，这不再是低成本的制造，而是高端的替代。而另一边，美国的选择显得特别矛盾。路易斯提到，美国在对华科技脱钩的同时，又依赖中国庞大的供应链。没有中国，苹果、特斯拉、沃尔玛的体系几乎难以为继。更讽刺的是，美国一边担忧中国的芯片进步，一边又试图让中国继续使用美国产的生态系统，以维持控制权。结果谁依赖谁，反而变成越来越模糊了。这让路易斯提出了一个直击根本的问题，那就是美国到底是想要和中国建立怎么样的关系呢？商业伙伴还是长期的敌手呢？在他看来，美国的政治界至今没有答案。2018年之前一直是商业关系，2018年后变成敌对关系。但是，一旦彻底脱钩，损失的或许不是中国，而是美国本身。他甚至指出，如今连台湾议题都在悄然的降温，因为华盛顿意识到，如果再推高冲突，连导弹生产都有可能会受到中国稀土的制约。中美之间的较量已经不是冷战式的意识形态冲突，而是一场共依存的技术战争。脱钩的代价太高了，而竞争的节奏又无法放慢。问题是，当中国的产业版图不断的扩张，从能源到 AI， 从汽车到核电，那西方是否做好了被对手超越的心理准备呢？我们来看一下视频。
I'm so glad you start with 2018 because I do think this is a breaking point. And yes, I think that China was completely blindsided when the US banned semiconductors. To be honest, they just weren't expecting it. It was a shot across the bow. And yeah, to your point, I think in China panicked a little bit. They did think if they're banning us from semiconductors today, tomorrow it could be chemical products, it could be auto parts, it could be anything. And so they decided to essentially, they told the banks, guys, normal loans to real estate, all the money has to go to industry, all the money has to go into developing our own tech system. They also got all the big tech guys in a room and said, guys, the US has declared economic war on us. I know you've been making lots of money, optimizing puppy videos on the internet, and this was great. Well done, you. But from now on, you guys have to develop semiconductors. You have to develop your own servers, your own software. There was a mobilization of all resources towards that goal for the past 7 years. And during these 7 years, I think the Western world looked at China and very much, saw the consequent real estate bust. If in the US, the government said no more loans to real estate wouldn't be so hot. So you have a massive real estate bust. And when you picked up your copy of the FT, the Wall Street Journal, whatever else, all you got was the real estate bust for 7 years. And I think we were kind of blind to how quickly China was moving up the value chain on the back of this wave of capital. And by the way, not just money, not just physical capital, also human capital. Because essentially the tech companies were told, stop hiring the best engineers out of Tsinghua and Fudan, the best universities in China, to build video games. From now on, you're going to develop semiconductors. Now, China produces more STEM graduates every year than the whole rest of the world combined if you exclude India. It's China in 25 years has gone from 350,000 university students a year to 12 million university students a year. So it's an improvement in human capital. And this human capital is essentially being driven for the past 7 years towards you have to develop our own tech solutions. We have to develop our own industrial solution. We have to completely de-Westernize our supply chains. And now all of a sudden we wake up to a world in which China's producing the best cars, not just the cheapest cars, but also the best cars. Here's a mind-blowing fact. Like you take Audi in China has now, which was the very first Western brand in China. It was synonymous of luxury for the longest time. They've dropped their four-circle branding and the Audi name to adopt a Chinese branding because if you're in China now, European cars are perceived as inferior to Chinese cars. Just to put things in perspective. Another example, I'm sure you've seen the interview of the Ford CEO where he highlights that he went to China, was blown away by what he saw, and bought a Xiaomi and brought it back to the US. And he drives a Xiaomi to work every day. I mean, this is like the Coca-Cola CEO saying he'd rather drink Pepsi. It's kind of mind-blowing to me. So I think, to be honest, China has leapfrogged the West in industry after industry. Take turbines, take telecom switches, take everything except the very high end of semiconductors. China's by now leapfrogged the West. And we missed it because for 3 years, nobody visited China because of COVID. And then once COVID reopened, post-COVID, Russia had invaded Ukraine. Everybody missed that you had this huge step up in China's industrial capacity. And so now today, China's bidding in Saudi Arabia to build nuclear power plants at half the cost of the French. Being French, I look at this, I'm like, I always thought we'd own the nuclear space. I always thought that, we got lots of problems in France, but at least we got that. We don't even have that anymore. So it's, this for me, this one of the single most important macro development is how quickly China's moved up the value chain in terms of industry. And yes, it is knocking on the door of tech. And I'm sorry to be long-winded, but yesterday, the FT had an article saying, okay, now banning NVIDIA chips in China. I look at this and I think, okay, either that's hubris on the Chinese part. They think they're advanced enough that they actually don't need NVIDIA. Option one. And there was some inclination of that with DeepSeek, right? It's like, we can produce DeepSeek without the high-end NVIDIA chips. Or they think that, Chinese chips, the Huawei, the SMIC, et cetera, are like close enough that all they need is a little more impetus and they'll get there. Or alternatively, trying to trip up the US market. Because if you trip up NVIDIA, NVIDIA in 2.5 years has gone from a 300 billion market cap to a 4.3 trillion market cap. 4 trillion of wealth creation in one company in less than 2.5 years. Unprecedented in the history of capitalism.
Well, let's talk about, and I think, the semis, which you just mentioned, they have in China the backing of the state, right? They always have their national interest in mind, right? And when we think about what's going on over here, to your point about NVIDIA, they were making chips for gaming, for crypto mining, right? There was some data center sort of business, but there was a lot of competition yet. And we didn't have this sort of secular trend that emerged very quickly, right? So the idea that we would sell them, our largest adversary, who can rally, behind, with the support of their government for something, just listen, EVs, there's like 100 EV makers in China, right? And a half a dozen of them are going to be premier EV makers around the world, right? And we do have concern about that. But when it comes on our reliance on the Chinese for so many things that go into our defense and intelligence apparatus, we have a huge blind spot, right? So now let's go to GPUs, and they are clearly our national champion. This is NVIDIA, right? So the debate here is whether we sell them our best technology So that will make itself into their defense and intelligence apparatus, which is there to basically leapfrog us in so many different ways, right? So how do you think about this? Should we be selling them, even if it's a stripped down version, right, of our higher end GPUs? Because this is a battle that is really for supremacy on so many different levels for the next 50, 100 years, right? Is that fair to kind of categorize this that way? And that's really the debate. Should we be selling? Jensen Huang clearly has $4.3 trillion reasons why we should, but is it in our national interest to do so? And I get it. The idea is like, let's get them hooked on CUDA and, that sort of thing. But to your point about their ability to influence the rest of the world, there is going to be a digital Belt and Road, whether it's using Huawei chips or Xiaomi's backing or whatever the hell you want to kind of describe, or it's going to be on the backbone of our technology.
I think that's a good way to frame it. And to be honest, I'm not American, I'm not Chinese, I'm French. The question is, what relationship does the U.S. want to have with China? Is it a commercial relationship or is it an adversarial relationship? And it's not for me to answer. It's for you as voters. It's for U.S. policymakers to answer this. And I think the U.S. really hasn't decided what it wants to do. I think for up until 2018, essentially the U.S. was saying we definitely want a commercial relationship with China. We want to make as much money as possible, and so Apple puts its plants there, and Tesla puts its plants there, and Tesla provides the impetus for the EV industry to grow massively in China, etc. So up until 2018. The relationship was very clear. This is a commercial relationship. Everybody's trying to make as much money as possible. This is capitalism. Everybody's happy. Everybody works in the same direction. 2018, the relationship shifts. We're no longer commercial. We're now adversarial. And that was reinforced in 21 when Blinken and Sullivan met with their counterparts in Anchorage. Blinken came out of there saying the relationship will be commercial where it needs to be and adversarial where it needs to be, which, if you're China, you're like, well, where does that leave me? It's like, so, where is that line between adversarial and commercial? Can you be both at the same time? When the US had an adversarial relationship with the Soviet Union, it was understood that it was two separate worlds. There was very, very little commercial transactions. Today, if the US really wants to have an adversarial relationship with China, this has massive, massive implications for the U.S. stock markets. What's the value of Apple without China? What's the value of Tesla without China? What's the value of Walmart? What's the value of ExxonMobil that does a ton of business in China? All this in a way that just wasn't happening with the Soviet Union. So is an adversarial relationship with China in the U.S.'s long-term interest, to the extent that China is now essentially the biggest trade partner for almost every major market except for Mexico and Canada. If you turn around, if you're the US now and you tell a Brazil or you tell a Chile, perhaps even a Germany or a Turkey, hey, look, it's us or them, they might pick them. This isn't the Cold War all over again. So can the US even afford to have an adversarial relationship with China? And more importantly, what does the US get out of it? Like, what's the end goal? To have an adversarial relationship with China. The U.S. did very well out of the commercial relationship with China. It's huge profits again at companies like Apple, like Tesla, etc. What does the U.S. get out of the adversarial relationship? Why would they want it? How does it work? And I don't think this has been properly laid out for either U.S. policymakers or U.S. voters. But again, it's not for me to decide. What I do note is that right now you essentially have your bum in between two chairs, where sometimes you want to be commercial, sometimes you want to be adversarial, and I think you get the worst of both worlds. Now, we're in a totally different environment. We're in a much healthier environment. And we're in a healthier environment because if you go back to 2018, when the US punches China, China takes the punch. You go back to 2021, China punches China again takes the punch. But during this time, it's preparing. 2025, Trump comes back in and punches China again. And this time, China says, okay, you want to do this? Fine. Gloves off. Let's go. You put embargo on semiconductors. I put embargo on rare earths. I put embargo on magnets. You want tariffs on me? I put tariffs on you. And China was the only one who fought back against Trump. EU took the punch. Canada, Mexico, they took the punch. India, Brazil, everybody took the punch. China fights back. And amidst this fight back from China, the U.S. realizes, hold on, without the magnets, in 2 weeks, the GM plant is shutting down. You've got Raytheon and Lockheed Martin saying, look, in a month, we can't provide weapons to Israel anymore. We can't provide them missiles because we're running out and we can't produce them without the rare earths. And so all of a sudden, the U.S. realizes that, yes, China's vulnerable to us, but we're actually also vulnerable to China. So you get to this status quo, uneasy status quo. You look at the past 4 months, all of a sudden, nobody's talking Taiwan anymore. Again, do the Google search. It's fallen off the media landscape because we've now reached, I think, this truce between the U.S. and China where the U.S. realizes if we push China too hard, this is actually going to start hurting us big time because, if the U.S. can't produce missiles, is it still the U.S.?